Welcome to Wild Side, your wild true crime podcast.
We're your hosts, who are sisters, storytellers, and truth seekers.
I'm Bailey, a therapist who is fascinated by all weird and dark human behaviors.
And I'm Chelsea, an educator here to unearth the facts behind the cases.
We cover true crime because some cases are just too dark to forget,
and others are too wild to ignore.
We're so glad you're here, so buckle up
and enjoy the ride.
Welcome back, Wildsiders.
It's good to have you back. I hope all is well. So tonight, or today, depends on when you're listening, we have a story that is going to violate trust. There's some cutting edge technology involved. I mean, it's just kind of wild. But before we get into that, we wanted to say thank you to a couple of our Spotify listeners. We have Jay Connected and I'm the Princess. So we appreciate your feedback. We were like yesterday years old when we realized that we could the comments on Spotify.
One of my friends reached out and she's like, do you even read the comments on Spotify? And I was like, what are you talking about? What comments on Spotify? And she's like, I've been leaving you comments for a year and you never responded. And I was like, I didn't know that was a thing. And so we had to like jump through fiery hoops and, you know, sacrifice our firstborn to figure out how to create this account to log in and see. And then it only shows me comments up until 2 months ago. So there's no telling what we've missed since like before then.
So if you guys are like, hate those girls, they don't ever respond back to me. So sorry. I literally didn't know. I'm sorry that we're 80 years old. It's a struggle.
Most people use 10% of their brains. Chelsea and I together use a good 5.
It's hard. It's a hard knock life. All right. So let's move on so we don't get ridiculed for too much banter back and forth.
Right. So we wanted to start off. So this is going to be a really heavy case for a lot of people. And it has to do with a newly identified serial rapist. And probably one of the most significant discoveries in recent history as far as the just sheer number of victims. And just before we dive in, a couple of things. One, this is our interview week, and we interviewed with a wonderful woman. She's a saint. Her name is Marie McKenzie, and she's a S.A.N.E, and that stands for a sexual assault nurse examiner. And so while we're going to cover this case around serial rapist, then we have an interview with Marie about what happens after, right? What does that process look like? What is the healing, the support, and that kind of thing? And just to put it in perspective, a couple of stats for you guys. Studies show that, because this is going to come up in our interview, studies show that false rape accusations are extremely rare, only 2 to 10%. But for some reason, I think people get hung up on this like falsely accused point. And so I just encourage us to focus more on, like, instead of the possibility of it being a false report, let's focus on the overwhelming reality of cases where it is absolutely not a false report.
Correct. Well, and like Marie talks about in the interview, you can always, and I say you can always, I know you can't use always or never. If it's not true, a lot of times you can disprove it, right? So to me, it's better to go ahead and believe it, investigate it.
Right.
And if it turns out that it was all a hoax or someone was lying, I get it. I'm not going to dive too deep into that because I know it's a very controversial subject. But I think statistics show that we should be more on the side of caution than we are on people crying wolf.
Yeah.
And that is going to lead us, like I said, into today's story. So tonight we're going to dive into a case that is a horrifying as it is deeply unsettling, a case that shattered the safety of an elite academic institution and left behind a staggering number of victims, most of whom never even knew what happened to them.
This is the case of Zhenhao Zhou, a brilliant PhD student at University College London, whose intelligence and access to resources made him not just simply dangerous, but almost undetectable. His crimes went unnoticed for years, hidden behind the walls of academia in the guise of respectability.
This is a story of trust violated, of cutting edge technology used for the worst possible purposes, and of a police investigation that unearthed one of the most extensive sexual crime sprees in modern history. So, guys, you've heard it before, but we're going to remind you again, buckle up, because this one is a nightmare that played out in real life.
And like our case last week, this is an ever-evolving case. And so to get started, we need to start with the man at the center, and that is Zhenhao Zhou. On paper, Zhou is the kind of person you'd expect to be making headlines for something like the Nobel Peace Prize or groundbreaking research, not criminal charges. Zhou's story began in Guangdong province, southern China. He grew up in the industrial city of Dongguan, where his father worked in a state-owned company and his mother was a teacher. Zhou was raised in a well-educated family and by all accounts had access to what many would consider considerable wealth. In 2017, at just 20 years old, he left home in China to study mechanical engineering at Queen's University in Belfast in Northern Ireland. He was a bright student with a really promising future, and then later ended up moving to London in 2019, where he enrolled in the University College London, which is one of the UK's most prestigious universities. It was there where he pursued his master's degree, and then after completing that, Zhou ended up becoming a PhD student in artificial intelligence. What are these themes the last few episodes of like technology and AI?
I don't know, but like I said, that's what I'm studying right now. It's a whole thing, guys. It's a double-edged sword.
Zhou was described as intelligent, ambitious, and for the most part, actually pretty unremarkable. He was just a student dedicated to his studies. On the outside, he appeared well off, put together, but as it usually is with these cases, the truth was actually much, much darker. His meticulously maintained exterior masked a really deeply disturbed individual that was right beneath the surface. There was a darker transformation that was unfolding. Zhou's lifestyle took a sharp turn at some point in the past few years. He projected an image of success and refinement, but again, his carefully curated appearance told a very different story. Underneath that, he was really struggling with chronic insomnia and had even undergone hair transplants after he lost most of his hair. And a lot of people think this was naturally a really desperate attempt to maintain this like polished facade that he had going. His efforts didn't just stop there. He also had cosmetic procedures on his eyelids and chin, fine-tuning his features to craft the image he wanted the world to see. In the clinical world, we call this image management, where you try really hard to manage the image that other people have of you. He began experimenting with drugs, specifically like ketamine, cocaine, ecstasy, things like that, and began really plunging into the city's nightlife, particularly within London's Chinese social circles. Zhou was very social and had a wide circle of friends and associates. Anyone affiliated with the Chinese community there in London knew Zhou. He wasn't someone who would allow himself to be overlooked, insignificant, or appear less than in any light. His nights were filled with clubbing, dating apps, and casual encounters. But these weren't just ordinary encounters or dates that Zhou would go on, and he wasn't just a student, he was actually a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Zhou is a predator who used his intelligence and access to technology to commit and document a series of horrifying crimes against women. He didn't operate with violence in the traditional sense. There were no break-ins, no weapons, no obvious physical force. To most of his dates, Zhou came across, again, as charming and this well-mannered guy, right? Perfect gentleman, PhD, the ultimate catch. He was, after all, a PhD student, which gave the impression that he was obviously an intelligent, well-rounded guy with a bright future. Someone who just couldn't be dangerous, right? Zhou would use popular dating apps like Bumble and the popular Chinese social media platform, including WeChat and Little Red Book, to meet women. Using the name Pakho online, he would ask women out for a drink or invite them back to his flat to study with him. What a perfect ruse, am I right? The super academic PhD student inviting women to his apartment to study. How non-threatening is that? Most of the women he matched with were fellow students, and many were also from within the Chinese community there in London. He paid several £1,000s a month to live in a luxury high-rise apartment in Elephant and Castle, South London. His luxurious 39th floor unit offered breathtaking views of the city. However, when the women would arrive to his apartment, instead of studying or having drinks with casual conversations, the night would end up not with romance, but with terror. Despite the chilling events that unfolded behind closed doors in his upscale apartment, Zhou's crimes did not end when he left London. When COVID-19 ramped up, he returned to China, but instead of leaving his predatory behavior behind, he escalated it. In November 2020, he delved deeper into the dark underworld of assault, using an obscure messaging app to download what was essentially an instruction manual on how to drug and rape young women. One of the advertisements that he had saved on his phone that police later found had the words, quote, "effects guaranteed," splashed across pictures of sleeping naked women. Hidden behind his polished exterior, again, was a predator, one whose crimes would only come to light when it was too late for his victims.
The walls of Zhenhao Zhou's upscale London flat concealed a lot more than just luxury. It hid the secrets of what was going to turn out to be a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde scenario. But like many criminals, Zhou made mistakes and totally underestimated the sheer number and tenacity of his victims. A detail that ensured that someone remembered something despite how hard he tried to cover his tracks. And that is exactly what happened. According to a BBC article by Daniel Sanford, one of Zhou's first identified victims, only referred to as Miss N, she was a young Chinese student trying to adjust to life in London when she first met Zhou in May of 2023. She noted that Zhou seemed friendly and intelligent, someone who could very simply just help her with her math because she was a fellow student. A few days after their initial meeting, Zhou invited Miss N to a party in another apartment within this luxury high-rise, the Uncle Building in Elephant and Castle. The night was filled with music, laughter, and the kind of easy conversation that made a foreign city feel a little less lonely. But as the party wound down, Zhou leaned in with his suggestion, "Come back to my place for a bit." Now, to be fair, there had been absolutely zero red flags up until this point, and Miss N had spent time with him, so she agreed. When she found herself inside his sleek 39th floor apartment, Zhou's demeanor shifted. He kept encouraging Miss N to drink, which started to make her feel really uncomfortable, and she tried to leave. but Zoe wouldn't let her. He dragged her by her clothes from the front door to his bedroom, where he continued pressuring her to drink alcohol. The next thing Miss N remembers is waking up at about 6 a.m. in his bed, naked and feeling dizzy and drowsy, but most importantly, with the sickening sense that something terrible had happened. In the days following the incident, Zoe and the woman, Miss N, exchanged text messages. At one point, he sent her a message that could be interpreted, because again, it was translated from Mandarin, that said either, quote, "It was wrong," or "I did something wrong." The next day, her response was direct and filled with fury. "You are so disgusting." Then, with unwavering resolve, she added, "Now I just want to expose you." Miss N reported the assault to the police soon after, but sadly, as with many victims, the system failed her. For Miss N, she was initially brushed aside due to a poor translator and arguably a dismissive police response. The Metropolitan Police would go on to admit that they do regret how they handled this report, but it honestly speaks to some bigger issues at play with this case and worldwide for victims. Regardless of all of this, due to these barriers, Miss N ultimately made the painful decision not to pursue the allegation.
Now, imagine traveling across the world for an education, carrying your family's hopes and sacrifices on your shoulders. Then something unthinkable happens, a violation so deep it shakes your sense of self. But instead of finding support, you're met with silence, shame, and an overwhelming fear of losing everything. For many women, especially those from East and Southeast Asian backgrounds, reporting sexual assault isn't just about seeking justice. It's about the risk of being blamed, the fear of being sent home in disgrace, the crushing weight of cultural expectations. Advocacy groups like the CIAC, the S.E.E.A.W.A., and South Hall Black Sisters have been fighting against violence for decades, yet survivors still face barriers. Language hurdles, distrust in the system, and the cold reality of structural racism. Victims are often blamed, and they just don't know their rights. However, despite Miss N's pain and confusion, she fought and clung to her courage. If not for her, this case would likely have turned out different or would not have come to discovery at all. Despite Miss N's not formally pursuing the allegations, she just couldn't shake the horror of what had happened to her. The police had dismissed her, but she wasn't ready to stay silent. Desperate to warn others, she turned to Red Note, a Chinese social media app, and posted about her experience with Zoe. She never expected what happened next. A woman, known only as Miss L, saw the post and responded, "You're not alone. It happened to me too."
Miss L's story began in August of 2021 when she was just 19 years old. She and Zoe had met before, had even slept together consensually a couple of times, and it had all seemed super normal until the night that changed everything. The two had planned a casual evening out, meeting with a group of friends at a restaurant in London's Chinatown. From there, however, the night blurred into another stop, this time a private room at a different restaurant. The drinks flowed, bottle after bottle of Jack Daniels disappearing between them. And then, nothing. Miss L's memories of what happened next were a void until she woke up. She was in Zoe's flat, and he was on top of her, and she had not agreed to this. But that didn't stop him. It was after the second report about Zoe that prompted detectives to revisit Miss N's accusations. Law enforcement now had two different women making very similar allegations about this one individual, and this absolutely needed to be looked into. However, just 2 days later, investigators learned that Zoe had ditched town. He hopped on a plane to China, and there just wasn't anything that Met Police could do at the time. Luckily, it only took about 2 months before Zoe decided to grace London with his presence once again. He ended up returning back to London in January of 2024. It was there that the Metropolitan Police immediately arrested Zhenhao Zhou. What had initially begun as a single accusation quickly spiraled into a full-on investigation. Investigators then wasted no time obtaining a search warrant for his luxury high-rise apartment. I wonder, it just makes me think how at odds the scene must have been. There's this luxury upscale apartment that's being raided, quite literally, by law enforcement on grounds of rape and who knows what else. How weird that must have been to see. When law enforcement began combing through Zhou's apartment, they were searching for anything that could reveal the true extent of his crimes. Honestly, law enforcement did expect to find some sort of evidence, but they weren't sure exactly what it would be. But what they did end up finding was something even more just disgusting than what they ever thought that they would find. Amid the sleek furniture and luxury decor, officers found a really gross collection, a large quantity of alcohol, ecstasy, and a powerful industrial chemical that transforms in the body into the notorious date rape drug, GHB. So he had it all. He had MDMA, butanediol, ketamine, Xanax, all of the type of substances that typically are linked to some sort of incapacitation and control. Are you guys following what this might mean? Investigators quickly realized that Zhou didn't really need to rely on force when it came to victims. He didn't need to. He would use drugs. He would spike his victims' drinks, forcefully encourage them to drink, and would wait until they were unconscious before he raped them. Then they woke up groggy, disoriented, and never even realizing that they had been drugged and assaulted. They simply left his apartment believing they just blacked out from drinking too much.
But the most damning evidence wasn't the stash of drugs in his apartment. It was what lurked inside his seized electronic devices. The deeper investigators dug, the more horrifying the case became. Zhou hadn't just assaulted his victims, he had documented everything. He filmed everything. The footage showed him attacking multiple women, most of them completely unconscious, unaware of the nightmare unfolding around them. But it wasn't just the recordings that made it so sinister. Zhou had meticulously cataloged his crimes. He saved the footage. He named the files. He took notes. The recovered videos depicted a man believed by police to be Zhou assaulting multiple women who appeared to be under the influence of drugs, covertly slipped into their drinks. In the collection, investigators found video evidence of Mrs. N's assault. Zhou's hidden camera had captured more than just his words. It had recorded him plying her with drinks, and worse, the photos on his phone showed exactly what had happened to her that night. This time, there was no doubt. "Miss N, finish the drink," he said again and again and again. His voice captured on a hidden spy camera near his bed. "Finish the drink. It should not be wasted." Disturbingly, the majority of these women remained unidentified, with some footage failing to capture their faces at all. The footage showed some women with slurred speech, while some appeared visibly distressed, yet unable to resist due to the drug's effects. In one particularly harrowing video, Zhou is seen looking directly, oh gosh, y'all, I'm sorry, this gives me chills. Zhou is seen looking directly into the camera while his victim, sporting bruises around her left eye and cheekbone, struggles beneath him. Audio from the same clip captures her pleading in Mandarin, only for Zoe to cruelly dismiss her pain. Other videos reveal the complex and sinister nature of drug-facilitated assault. While some victims appear completely unconscious, others experience brief moments of euphoria, further complicating the investigation and reinforcing just how calculated and predatory Zoe's actions were. This wasn't a crime of impulse. It was a calculated, methodical operation, and it had likely been happening for years.
Now, this is absolutely staggering. After this raid of his apartment, in total, investigators found 1,270 videos amounting to 1,660 hours of footage. This included 58 recordings of Zoe raping women. And if that wasn't just sickening enough in and of itself, authorities uncovered something even more awful. A box. Hidden inside his wardrobe was a yellow Fendi box filled with pieces of jewelry and clothing. Zoe had dismissed it as lost property, but police knew exactly what this was. It was his trophy collection. Small, intimate items taken from his victims, tokens of the lives that he had destroyed. But there were still some missing pieces. Zoe, after all, had studied in Belfast in Ireland before moving to London. But investigators couldn't find any computers or phones or cameras from his time there. So the big question was, had his campaign of drug-facilitated rape already begun back then, or had he only escalated once he arrived in London? Now, typically in rape investigations, detectives start with a victim and work to identify the perpetrator. In this case, however, it was the complete opposite. The suspect now is known, but the victims remained largely unidentified. When police began uncovering the hundreds of videos of Zhenhao Zoe attacking unconscious women, they knew they were looking at a serial rapist. But the question was, why did so few victims come forward? Shouldn't there be many, many more women pretty much breaking down the doors at the police station? Well, according to Vinnie Poon, a trustee at the Chinese Information and Advice Center, or the CIAC, she herself wasn't surprised. Vinnie, who has spent the past decades supporting East Asian women in the UK, explains that for many Chinese women, silence isn't just a choice, it's survival. Some may not have even known what happened to them. Others, perhaps the ones that do remember, may choose to have buried it, but most of them, honestly, will likely never report it. She further explains that in Chinese culture, people lock everything up inside and won't tell anybody anything, especially if it is very shameful. They will hide things even from their parents, and they learn to suffer in silence. Now, the thing that gets me about this is Zhenhao Zhou is also Chinese. So to me, he weaponized this very part of his culture. He was a predator who targeted these women who, in his mind, he could count on to stay silent. So the really scary question is, how many victims are still out there, unseen, unheard, and totally afraid? And how many more will never even know they were victims at all? I can't even imagine.
Well, and Bailey, that's what we had talked about, is a lot of times, according to these women, they would wake up and they didn't know, right? They couldn't remember. They didn't have any real evidence. They thought something had happened. So again, how do you report something that you don't even know happened, right?
Yeah. And not to mention if most of them are immigrants and they don't really know their laws or their rights. I mean, there's so many barriers like we talked about. You've got the language barrier, you've got being an expat barrier, like there's just so much. And if you're not even sure yourself, why go through that anxiety of potentially not being believed or what have you to make a report?
Sure. I mean, if you think about it, if it were me and I were thinking about this process, I would be like, okay, I'm going to go tell the police and I'm going to tell them this. And then if they ask me what happened, am I literally just going to say, I don't really know, but I think? You know what I mean? Like, I
Of
would be able to
course.
talk myself out of that
Sure.
quickly. Now, by the time UCL was informed of the allegations, it was too late for Zoe's victims. But the university, and props to the university, acted swiftly, suspending Zoe just a few days after his arrest. They cut ties with him immediately and attempted to support students and staff affected by his crimes, offering resources through their online portal and backing the police appeal. But the women whose lives had been shattered, no university statement or support group could undo the damage he had already done. But Zoe, well, again, he really was no ordinary predator. His depravity ran deeper than anyone had initially realized. His crimes weren't just about power or control. They were this twisted culmination of a deeply ingrained obsession. And when investigators began questioning him, the full extent of his sickness came to light. During interrogation, God, this guy's just gross. I'm sorry, but Zoe, he just got even more icky, right? He admitted to investigators that he would spend hours searching for extreme pornography, specifically videos depicting unconscious or unresponsive women. His fixation went as far as being obsessed with a genre known as time stop pornography, where women appeared frozen, unable to move or resist. When asked why this particular content fascinated him, his answer revealed everything about his mindset. This is what he said. He said, I like it because the girl appears to be still and quiet when they are having sex.
I could go into there's so much wrong with this dude. I mean, for obvious reasons, being a serial rapist, but the fact that he can't have any sort of interaction from women, especially in a sexual setting, it's just like, I'm sorry, I'm going to be the one to say it. You guys can write me hate mail, but what a bitch. He's a bitch.
I'm sure Bailey could do an entire therapy hour on the root causation and possible root causations of this. But I think it sums up, like she said, just a weak little man.
Yes.
What investigators learned is that not only did Zoe lure women to his London apartment, drug them, and rape him, he also did this in China. How did they know? Well, that's a great question. Investigators had to analyze the details from the videos and were able to identify electrical sockets in the background of his videos, determining that some of his attacks occurred in China. The scale of his crimes, I mean, really, when you think about it, I mean, this is enormous. This is going multi-continental, if you will. Investigators identified at least 23 confirmed victims, but the true number, I mean, it could be higher, right? It possibly over 60. The scope of his crimes were staggering. Based on the disturbing videos detectives found, police estimated that Zoe may have assaulted well over 50 women. half in the UK, half in China, making him one of the most prolific sex offenders in British history.
Just to repeat, in the whole ass history of Britain, right? That is a trophy nobody, an achievement, accomplishment that nobody should want ever.
Nobody's clapping for you, Zoe. Nobody's clapping for you.
He's the worst. This dude's the worst. His chin probably sucks too, even though he got surgery to fix it. Okay. Zhenhao Zhou's trial began, wait for it, just a couple months ago in January of 2025 at the Inner London Crown Court. And the charges against him were 11 counts of rape, 12 counts or charges of possessing extreme pornography, 8 counts of possessing a controlled drug with the intent to supply, 3 counts of voyeurism, which is watching through things with non-consenting victims, and 1 count of false imprisonment. As the case unfolded, it became super clear that Zoe wasn't just a predator, like we've said 1,000 times throughout this case, but he was a meticulous, calculated offender, right? So he wasn't an impulsive predator, which is scary in and of itself, but being meticulous and calculated is really, really, really scary. In court, he admitted that he had sex with the unconscious women, but that it was one of his fantasies. And he tried to claim, here we go, like they all go to this. I don't know if there's like a forum on Reddit that they all use, but he tried to claim that the women in his videos were not victims at all. Instead, he insisted that all of these women who were being secretly recorded, and they had no idea, were acting and playing roles in a staged rape fantasy skit or whatever in exchange for money and gifts. Obviously, we all know that this was a really wimpy and desperate defense, and thank goodness that the jury saw through it simply because of the massive amount of evidence that told a different story. Throughout the trial, investigators obviously shared with the court that they had uncovered 1,270 videos documenting Zoe's attacks that he painstakingly recorded and stored. Some showed women, and just as a side note, I couldn't imagine being in this court or the jury and having to watch this. But some of the videos shown were women slurring their words, visibly distressed, yet too incapacitated to resist. Others were women who were completely unconscious, motionless as he violated them repeatedly. And then there were the most horrifying clips, the ones where the victims woke up mid-assault and pleaded for him to stop. In one such video, you can hear a woman crying, and Zoe's response is, "It's pointless. The sound insulation here is very good." The jury also heard the testimony of one of the few victims who had been identified. The woman who had met Zoe at a popular hot pot restaurant in London's Chinatown in September of 2021. Over the course of the evening, she had testified that he encouraged her to drink heavily, again, pushing Jack Daniel's whiskey on her until she could barely stand. And then the next thing she remembered was waking up in Zoe's apartment only to find him raping her. Weeks later, in a phone call, Zoe tried to justify what he had done. He said, "I thought you were conscious at the time." Her response to the jury was hauntingly simple. "I did not agree."
But one of the most distressing cases was that of female a woman who appeared in 2, not 1, but 2 separate videos filmed in Zoe's student accommodations in Bloomsbury. Police never discovered her identity, nor could they determine whether she had been assaulted before or after Zhou's return from China during the pandemic. The first video showed her unconscious at the start, but she eventually woke up and begged Zhou to stop. "I hate you," she whispered. Zhou, unfazed, responded, "It's pointless." The second video was just as harrowing. Initially, when detectives found the footage, they couldn't extract the sound. Zhou insisted that the women had consented, but just before the trial, forensic specialists recovered the audio, revealing female A's slurred, drugged plea for him to stop. Zhou quickly changed his story, claiming it was, quote, rape role play. Luckily, the jury didn't buy it. Even his own testimony in court betrayed him. When his barrister, Mark Cotter KC, asked about his preference for unconscious women, Zhou admitted, "Yes, that's my favorite type, but I could not find that." It was a horrifying glimpse into the mind of a predator who saw his victims not as people, but as objects to be used and discarded.
The case against Zhou was overwhelming, thankfully. In March, this month of 2025, after a 4-week trial, the jury ended up finding Zhenhao Zhou guilty of drugging and raping 10 women across England and China. He was also convicted of voyeurism, possession of extreme pornographic images, false imprisonment, and possession of drugs with the intent to commit sexual offenses. However, I guess it's worth noting, he was acquitted of several lesser charges, including the possession of MDMA and ketamine for the purpose of assault. I'm sure there's a reason behind that, but I don't know what it was. As the verdict was read, the court was reminded of the staggering scale of his crimes. Investigators again had confirmed at least 23 victims. And if we wanted to break that down, that's easily a victim a month, right? And that's over a 2-year span. So who knows what the frequency looked like. But again, investigators feared that the real number could be as high as 60 women. Many of the women, again, in his videos had never come forward, and some may never even know that they were assaulted. And I couldn't imagine the thought. It's really hard for my brain to comprehend the thought that there are women out there who have videos made of them and they don't know it, right? At sentencing, the judge didn't mince words, calling it, quote, one of the worst cases of serial sexual offending in recent history, end quote. Somehow, justice just kind of felt incomplete. After the verdict, police acknowledged the painful truth that Zhou, again, could be one of the worst sex offenders in UK history. And on top of that, the full extent of his crimes may never even be known at that point. Zhou will be sentenced on June 19th of this year. And hopefully Judge Rosina Cottage is correct, saying that he is dangerous and a predatory sexual offender and that his sentence will be very long.
You know, I really feel like this case raises a lot of disturbing questions, right? The questions that kind of pop into your head, but then you don't really want to spend any time on them, so you brush them aside, right? How can universities and institutions do a better job protecting people from predators hiding in their ranks, right? Could we do better? Is that something that's within our control? And then let's also talk about drug-facilitated sexual assault, because Zhou's case isn't the first. And mark our words, and I think you all know this, but it's not going to be the last. These crimes are incredibly difficult to detect because things that we've already talked about, victims often don't have a clear memory of what happened. It's one of the reasons why predators like Zoe, I mean, they just get by with it for so long, right? So again, what can people do to stay safe? And this is where this is going to be kind of our PSA hour for you guys. First, and I talk to my teenage girls that I mentor all the time, right? Always be aware of your drink, please. And girls and guys, right? Both of you guys and gals. Never leave them unattended. Second, if you wake up after a night out feeling unusually groggy or with memory gaps, don't dismiss it as just drinking too much. If something feels off, trust that instinct, right? You usually have something in you that tells you that something is not right. And third, we need stronger institutional responses to cases like this because Zoe isn't a one-off.
No, there was a statistic somewhere that I ran across saying that there is a sexual assault that happens every 67 seconds.
Yeah.
And so, if you think about it, our cases average like an hour an episode. That is what, 60 victims?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yep.
Just in one episode. It's awful. I hate it. And Zoe's crimes, again, dozens of filmed attacks on unsuspecting women, echo, unfortunately, a global trend where our technology is getting to the point where it's enabling predators, and justice is having a hard time keeping up. Groups like Southall Black Sisters warn that digital abuse is escalating, but authorities are failing to treat it with urgency, right? It's this lag that we're seeing in all facets around sexual abuse.
Uh-huh.
And with abysmally low prosecution rates, many survivors lose faith in the system before they even report it, right? Because you hear horror stories and you don't want to put yourself through that. But, there is hope for any victim out there. Think about the women who came forward against Zoe. They prove that justice is possible. Had they not come forward, it could have been years before he was caught. Our hope is that courage of survivors sparks change, not just in the communities across Britain, but worldwide. When survivors are heard, when they're believed, and when real protection exists, that's when the cycle of silence is finally broken. Zhenhao Zoe may be behind bars now, but this case really serves as an unfortunate and terrifying reminder that sometimes the biggest threats aren't creepy, gross dudes lurking in dark alleys, but right in front of us disguised as ordinary people. It's a theme that we've come across like the last, 8 cases we've covered, right?
Uh-huh.
And we will be following any new developments on this case. And for now, make sure to stay vigilant, stay safe, and as always, question everything.
Yeah. So, like Bailey said, we have a fantastic interview that's going to be dropping on Friday. Again, Miss Marie McKenzie is a S.A.N.E. So that is a sexual assault nurse examiner. And she's going to walk us through the process of that. So if you believe that you have been a victim, if you know that you have been a victim, again, if you think you might have been a victim, it is okay. You can go and get checked out. You can find help and medical attention. And again, I'm not going to talk too much on that because the interview is going to walk through that in great detail. But again, as Bailey said, stay vigilant, stay safe, and as always, question everything.
We will link resources for you guys in the show notes per usual. And like always, you guys, thank you for hanging out with us through this wild and crazy, gross, shitty chin serial rapist of a ride. His cheeks probably suck too.
Oh, yeah. probably. And as always, we'll catch you on the wild side.
Bye, guys.
Later, Gators.
God, he's the worst.
Hey, Wildside Tribe, don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Wildside Podcast.
Make sure to tune in on Wildside Wednesdays. New episodes will drop each Wednesday at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
We would love to hear from you, so if you have a wild case recommendation, email us at wildsidepodcast@gmail.com. That's wildside with a C. Or share your thoughts in the comments below.
As always, if you haven't heard it today, you're loved, you're worthy, and you're valuable. And we'll catch you on
The flip side.